We just put together a project in Indonesia on restoring mangroves. And it's 2,000 hectares, and over 40 years, the local communities will get in excess of $100 million.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. With me, I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm here with Tim Coles. Tim is the founder and chief executive of an organisation called rePLANET. And Tim and rePLANET are pioneering the use of biodiversity credits or tokens for funding rewilding nature restoration at scale. Now, historically, restoring landscapes, creating new marine protected areas and so on has been reliant either on philanthropic funding from the goodness of people's hearts and or from public funding. And governments, as we know, are pretty strapped for cash all over the world. So Tim's big idea, and that of the wider biodiversity credits movement, is that we can harness private markets to unleash a whole new scale of funding for nature recovery. Tim, thank you so much for taking the time to have a word with me today.
It's a pleasure.
Tim, how did you personally get into nature restoration and conservation? Is this something you've done all your life?
Yes, ever since university, I've worked in wildlife conservation and quantifying biodiversity all around the world. So I started in the forerunner of the Environment Agency, and then into the Institute of Environmental Assessment, and then eventually into setting up Operation Wallacea, which is an organisation that funds scientists to do long-term biodiversity research around the world. And that was going fine, Ben, until the pandemic came along, and you tried taking people on expedition in a pandemic. And so we had all of these scientists sitting around, and we thought, well, what are we going to do with them all? And one of the things we thought of was, how are you going to start getting private sector funding to go into wildlife conservation? And for that, you're going to need to work out how you quantify biodiversity change. If you go into something like the carbon world, everybody knows that the unit of carbon is a ton of carbon dioxide not emitted or sequestered. And that's fine, you've got a unit to work with. What's the equivalent in biodiversity? And that was the problem that we set out to try and solve.
And when it comes to measuring biodiversity, sort of baseline surveying and so on, there's a long history of doing this. The IUCN Red List, for example, is published every year or two, which shows how species are faring and which species are under threat and so on. And that's involved very large numbers of scientists actually getting out into the field and counting stuff. But the technology of measuring biodiversity has improved no end in recent years. For example, Nature Metrics, set up by Cat Bruce, is a company that takes a thimbleful of water from a watercourse or a lake or whatever and can find from the DNA contained in that water not just which species are present or have been present, but also in what abundance. And then there's bioacoustic technology where the recording of a space is carried out and birdsong and so on, and then artificial intelligence then identifies what birds and bats and so on are there. Chirrup.ai is a business I came across recently that's doing that. They set up some recording devices at Canwood. So the process of understanding what biodiversity is in a place has got a lot easier because of technology. Is that right?
Oh, yes, definitely. There have been huge advances in that. You always have to remember that any technique you use for quantifying biodiversity has advantages, but also disadvantages. And if you're going to do a thorough assessment, then you need to use a range of techniques. But the advantage of some of the modern technology stuff is that it can really cut the costs of doing this sort of monitoring. And the other way of cutting costs that we find is, instead of taking the scientist to collect the data, because that's the expensive bit, flying them out to the Amazon to do bird point counts or whatever, it's an awful lot easier to take the data to the scientist.
So let's just take a step back for a moment. So historically, an NGO, Fauna and Flora International or the Nature Conservancy or one of the wildlife trusts in the UK would buy a bit of land or perhaps be gifted a bit of land, and then they would raise money from charity and, if they were lucky, perhaps from the public sector, in order to carry out conservation work and to protect that landscape into the future. That was the only show in town. Brilliant John Burton, God bless him, who died last year, set up the World Land Trust, and there's roughly 1 million hectares in monument to his life, where he did exactly that. He bought crucial bits of land, corridors and so on all over the world, and restored them, rewilded them using philanthropic money. That was kind of conservation 1.0. And as we know, the amount of money available for that activity is simply not large enough to do this at scale. So then you got kind of conservation 2.0, where people started figuring out how they can generate revenues from these wild places. And nature tourism's an obvious one. And some of these nature-friendly commodity activities, forest honey or forest coffee, these kind of things came along. And then came along voluntary carbon. So can we just dwell for a moment on voluntary carbon? Can you just explain to me how that works? Because what I read is that very large amounts of money are being paid by Western corporations, Microsoft, Google, Qantas, and so on, towards the rewilding and protection of landscapes, whether it's restoration of mangroves at scale in Pakistan, or the purchase of imperiled rainforests in Belize, or paying for poaching ranges and so on in sub-Saharan Africa. How does that market work, and perhaps what have been the big issues that have come up around voluntary carbon and nature?
Okay, so there are two carbon markets. There's the compliance market, which is where the government is requiring particular sectors of the economy to control their carbon dioxide emissions. So things like power production and steel production and so forth fall into that category. But then there's all the other companies who say, well, okay, we're not part of this compliance industry, but we have voluntary targets to hit to reduce our carbon. And we're going to try and do as much as we can ourselves. But in the end, we're not going to be able to get rid of it all at the speed we want to do. So we'll buy what are called offsets. We will invest in projects that produce carbon that can offset some of the excess carbon dioxide emissions that we ourselves have got. Now, there's a whole range of different types of carbon credit. That's the problem. So if you've got a windmill, in the past, you could sell carbon credits because you've avoided using greenhouse gas emissions to generate that power. Now, most people these days regard those as not particularly good because that windmill would have generated that power anyway. So there's no real additionality. So that was the first of the problems that came across. And gradually, we've been moving to a system where a lot of the projects are investing in what are called nature-based solutions. They're saying, well, why don't we just use natural systems for storing carbon dioxide? Trees, they're pretty efficient at it, to be honest with you. Well, the best thing we've got. So if we're going to restore forests or to protect forests, then this is a way in which you can store your carbon or protect your carbon from being lost. And that's the move at the moment. That's what we want to encourage. Stop funding windmills and Tesla credits and use that money to invest in nature. Now, just look at the scale of this. In 2022, I think it was, $800 billion was spent on carbon. Most of that's in the compliance market, 2 to 3 billion of that in the voluntary market. Now, there's a requirement, according to the Global Biodiversity Framework, that we're short of about $800 billion to protect biodiversity. We need that every year. Well, that's already being spent on the carbon market. So if we can move the carbon to concentrate on nature-based solutions, you can kill both birds with one stone.
So just to ensure I understand this correctly, so most of the compliance markets, such as the European Union's emissions trading scheme, don't currently include nature-based carbon. So we're all given a cap, or the qualifying industries are all given a cap of the amount of carbon they're able to emit. And then if they do better than their cap in a given year, they can sell their excess as credits. And if they do worse than their cap, then they're forced by law to buy credits. And the cap comes down every year. And that's been hugely effective in the 1980s and 90s in eliminating acid rain. The cap and trade scheme on sulfur dioxide emissions was a massive success under Reagan. And the acid rain problem has more or less been eliminated. And of course, the European Union, under its emissions trading scheme, has cut emissions by 50% whilst growing its economy by about 250%. So it does work, but it doesn't benefit nature as yet. So are there going to be moves, do you think, to incorporate nature-based carbon credits in any of the large compliance markets? But before we talk about the voluntary markets in more detail.
Well, yes, we hope so, because one of the outputs from the Glasgow COP was that we should move to national carbon accounting. And that means bringing together both compliance and voluntary markets. Now, there's been obviously delays on that happening, but we would desperately like to see nature-based solutions become part of the compliance market. But there are various problems with that, of course, because one of the things you want with a compliance market is you want the price high, and you want to keep it high in order to discourage people from carrying on emitting. If you add too many additional projects into the scheme, that could force down the price of the compliance credits, which would be the opposite of what they're trying to achieve. And so it is a complicated move to try and bring together the compliance and the voluntary markets, but we're very much in favour of that happening.
Are there any compliance markets anywhere in the world that incorporate nature-based carbon? For example, California or New Zealand. New Zealand's seen a flush of these awful radiata pine and eucalyptus commercial monoculture tree plantations, and I'm told that they also qualify for carbon, which is a terrible outcome. So are there any that have genuine nature-based carbon in the mix?
Well, the two you mentioned you can have nature-based solutions in there, but that can be done, as I understand it, with eucalyptus, which is a terrible thing to be planting in some of those locations. And that brings us really round to the point is not all nature-based solutions are the same. So if you are planting a crop of eucalyptus, that is very different to restoring a native forest. And surely in the nature-based solutions market, there should be some differentiation between those different types of restoration. And that brings us to the point of actually needing to quantify biodiversity as well as carbon.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it also brings us on to this idea of a voluntary market. And a question I have in relation to the demand side of things. If I am a large company that is producing carbon emissions, what's to stop me saying I don't need to reduce those emissions because I can just buy offsets? Even if they're lovely nature-based offsets, presumably it's still not a great thing if I'm buying my way out of an obligation to reduce my own internal emissions.
Yes, absolutely. And that really isn't the purpose of these schemes. So most of the corporates are signed up to things like science-based targets initiatives, which requires them to reduce their own emissions, I think it's by 90%, and only use offsets for the last 10%. And I think that's an appropriate approach, and it does allow the corporates to then invest in some nature-based solutions which are also going to benefit biodiversity.
This is where nature measurement comes in and the idea of biodiversity credits comes in. What I think most people working in the space of natural capital find a little confusing is where is the line between a voluntary carbon credit where you're counting the amount of carbon that the nature you've restored is sequestering and a biodiversity credit? So I can understand the idea that we restore a salt marsh or we restore a seagrass meadow or an oyster reef or a forest and it sequesters carbon. And of course, the science is getting pretty good at telling us how much carbon it's sequestering. So we then tokenize that and sell it for X, £100 a ton or whatever it might be. What's the difference between that, a biodiversity first carbon credit and a biodiversity credit?
Okay, well, we think there are two different markets here. The first one is if you're a corporate that's buying carbon as an offset, isn't it nice if you can concentrate your investments in projects that produce at least, let's say, a 50% increase in biodiversity or a 100% increase in biodiversity? And that's the end of the market that we think is going to make the real difference in the short term. Because there is, as you mentioned, a grouping of tech companies called Symbiosis, and they've got fed up of buying carbon credits that are worthless, basically. And there are a couple of main reasons why they're regarded as worthless. The first one is what you're doing is if you're doing an avoided loss project where you're trying to protect a forest, and you make an assumption at the beginning of that at the moment about 2% of that forest is being lost every year. So if you're going to do a 25-year protection project, you can protect half of that forest, and the other half you count as your leakage zone. And you carry on with your project, and it's all working, it's all fine. And then what happens is the forest next door to you decides to do the same. And one of the arguments is, well, look at that. your assumption of 2% loss over 25 years is no longer true, because other forests are adopting exactly the same approach as you are. Now, that led to the headline in The Guardian of 94% of all carbon credits are worthless, which doesn't encourage investment into that particular marketplace. So that was the first problem. The second problem is fairness. And, and this is true. There are, when we moved into the carbon world, we were shocked sometimes because we have a rule in rePLANET that all the projects that we support have 60% of the benefits going to the local stakeholders. Now, that's not just your baseline budgets for, say, 40 years. 60% of that obviously goes to local stakeholders. But also, when you come to sell the credits from those projects, you sell them at a profit. 60% of that profit should also go back to the local communities. Now, that generates huge sums of money. For example, we just put together a project in Indonesia on restoring mangroves. And it's 2,000 hectares. And over 40 years, the local communities will get in excess of $100 million simply from the uplift, from the profits made on the uplift. But many carbon operators, we mentioned this to them, said, oh, that's nonsense. Give them 15%, they'll be happy. They won't know what to do with all that money. Well, that's not really the point. We're trying to get significant sums of money into some of the poorest communities in the world and uplift carbon and biodiversity at the same time.
So taking that project in Indonesia that you've been working on, it's the restoration of degraded mangroves, working in partnership with a local community. What's the unit that you're selling and who to in order to raise all that money for you and the community?
Okay, so we're selling carbon credits, and a unit of a carbon credit is 1 ton of carbon dioxide sequestered or not emitted. And what we're doing is being able to produce the carbon from there for about $15 to $20 is the production cost of that. But when you come to resell, then there's a huge uplift, particularly if you can get something like a symbiosis type support. In other words, you're selling the credits at around about $50. And that 60% of that uplift, because there's a very large number of carbon credits come from mangroves, generates a huge amount of money. Now, in the case of Indonesia, you're having to donate 20% to the government, you're having to pay 10% tax, but even allowing for that, there is still a huge amount of money they can get through to local communities.
And the buyers of those credits are typically large corporations, perhaps those which are already doing business in Indonesia, or maybe not. And what they're buying is carbon that they can use in their own internal carbon accounting, but they're paying a healthy price for it because of biodiversity having been the priority and because of all the ancillary benefits of supporting the local community. So it's kind of a charismatic carbon credit in a way.
Well, yes, but think of the opposite. Suppose we're not doing that, and you pay $50 for credit, and then open up The Guardian the following day, and you've been shown to be only giving a tiny amount of money to the community. So it's very much in the interest of the buyers to check how much money is actually getting through to the communities for their investments in carbon credits.
What if the government of Indonesia then ends up double counting in its own NDC, or I think it's called a nationally determined commitment under the Paris process, whereby countries declare how much they're reducing their emissions by? What if there's a double counting? How do you avoid that?
Well, in a place like Indonesia, you can't do a carbon project unless you go through their carbon registry, which is called the SRN. And that counts all the carbon that's being claimed in the country. And you are allowed under that system to be able to sell some of it on the voluntary market, and it is deducted from the NDC.
So, Tim, you talked about two markets. The first being carbon credits arising from projects that put nature and community first. The second, I guess, is biodiversity-only projects where carbon isn't a feature. Now, I interviewed for this podcast the team behind the Royal Commission for Alula in Saudi Arabia, where they're doing an extraordinary restoration of arid grassland on the western side of Saudi Arabia, 25,000 square kilometers, that will really go from desert to being this kind of seasonal arid grassland with gazelles and ostriches and maybe one day leopards and cheetahs. But I can't imagine the carbon sequestered through that rewilding project is worth very much. So how does a biodiversity token work, and what is that new market?
Okay, you're absolutely right. There are a whole series of projects you can't run with carbon. You're trying to protect high-value nature grasslands in Transylvania or rewild a Scottish island. There's not enough carbon in that to be able to make it run. So for that, you're going to need a separate income stream, and that's where biodiversity credits come in. Let's step back a little bit, because in order to get to a biodiversity credit, firstly, you've got to quantify your units of biodiversity gain. Take that as read, that we now know that we've got so many thousand units of biodiversity gain. Now, just as in carbon, you can't claim all of that as an uplift. You have to keep 20% as a buffer. And the other 80% is then issued as units of biodiversity credits, essentially, which reflect a 1% gain per hectare in the median value of a basket of metrics that reflect the conservation objectives of the habitats you're talking about with additionality and permanence. That's your definition of a unit for biodiversity to be the equivalent of the climate one. And 80% of the size of the claim, which is independently verified by a group of scientists called the Biodiversity Futures Initiative, and they go through every claim with a tooth comb. And they're very, very rigorous indeed. So if, for example, I say, look, I've got a 50% increase in biodiversity here, they ask you to send all the data. So you were talking about nature metrics and eDNA and metabarcoding. They don't just want the printout from them. They want the raw bioinformatics so they can actually rerun the whole thing. They want all your camera trap data, all your sound data, all your field data, and the R coding. And what they do is they take a sample of each of those data sets and compare it against your data sheets. And if that's correct, they then recalculate everything and they say one of three things. They say, yes, Tim, you have got a 50% increase in biodiversity in your site, or no, you haven't. You've made a mistake and we think it's closer to a 30% increase. Or worst of all, go away. That survey was so bad we can't actually quantify what the biodiversity uplift was. And so in order to avoid that second one happening, they introduced a stage one process where you say what your project is, you identify the metrics you're going to use to measure it, the methodologies and the sampling strategy. And they go through an iterative process, and at the end of that they say, we're happy with that as an approach. And that means that when you do your measuring and you come up with an estimate, you can't fail because you've measured the wrong things. You might not get your biodiversity increase, but you can't fail on that. And that is a crucial step in a biodiversity credit, having that independent verification stage and then issuing it. We issue them on blockchain. And the advantage of doing that is this 60% business I talked about. Remember, we're saying in carbon, we want 60% of the funding from the sale of those credits to go to local stakeholders, owners, users, managers of those sites. Well, that works for the first sale, but you can't commit the buyer to doing the same for the next sale on a normal system. But on blockchain, you can. Every time a sale is made on blockchain, the algorithm has 60% donated of any profits, donated to local stakeholders. So we're very keen on the sort of open registry blockchain approach for the issuance of biodiversity credits, and it allows you to then fund some of these projects that are really only producing biodiversity, tiny bits of carbon, but primarily biodiversity. And we've got a few examples of those.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. So let's just say a group of us partner up with a community in a degraded landscape somewhere in the world, and we set about developing a plan for restoring that ecosystem, whatever it may be. Let's say it's a temperate rainforest on the west coast of Ireland. And we can clearly demonstrate with scientific support that the landscape is degraded now, and that we have a plan for restoring biodiversity, nature in all its wonder in this Atlantic rainforest. And in the process of developing that plan, we put together a proposition to create credits, which are then externally verified. Who buys those credits and why do they buy them? And I've seen two announcements recently that caught my eye. The first was GlaxoSmithKline, the major pharmaceuticals business, which said it wanted to be nature positive. And the second I saw much more recently, last week, I think, was Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram and so on, which said that it would be buying X million dollars worth of biodiversity credits each year, starting next year. What does that really mean? Why are they buying these credits? Is it not just corporate philanthropy? What externally verified, high quality corporate nature philanthropy, or is there a kind of accounting purpose to these credits?
Okay, at the moment it is primarily corporate philanthropy because the business case for having to buy biodiversity credits really hasn't properly been made yet. Now, we're at the start of a process where this is beginning to happen because the European Union is requiring corporates in different sectors now to start reporting on their nature impacts. Once you start asking corporates to measure, to report, they have to measure. And once they start measuring, they realise, hang about, we've got a problem here. And it encourages them to start looking at investing in projects. But at the moment, it's not there. So we see the problem is how on earth do you get biodiversity credits trading? You know, if I want to fund a carbon project, it's easy. I go to an investor and I say, look, can I have 5 million for this project? Or I'll produce credits at this price. And they look at it and say, okay, well, we'll make money on that. We'll invest in it. You can't do that with biodiversity at the moment because nobody knows what the prices are. So you need to get biodiversity credits trading first in order to establish prices to then get commercial investments in it. So that's what we're looking at. We think philanthropy is the answer at the moment in the short term. In other words, people investing in projects because they believe in those projects and would do it anyway. But why not measure the biodiversity benefits and issue credits to the philanthropists? They can then sell those credits, return their initial investment, make a small IRR, and that will then start establishing prices. So we see, the Metas and various family offices around the world are looking to kickstart biodiversity credit markets by investing in philanthropic projects and using exactly the system that I just talked about. Once you've got that, you can then start getting commercial investments coming in. And that's the big one we need, because you'll never fix biodiversity just on philanthropic type approaches. You're going to need them to be proper commercial investments.
So the idea is initially philanthropists and forward-thinking corporates start a market in these credits, start buying these credits, and thereby establish pricing, establish a market, get the money flowing. And in due course, these credits could come to serve an accounting purpose for corporates across sectors, across geographies, in the way that carbon does today, as some of these kind of nature impact reporting requirements begin to become law and companies start being required by law to be nature positive. That makes really good sense. So where are we at now in this biodiversity only credits market? Now we've talked a little bit about voluntary carbon, and I think lots of people who listen to my podcast will be aware of projects around the world that have been funded through voluntary carbon. It's becoming quite well established, albeit with a bit of turbulence in recent years. But what about biodiversity only credits? Can you give me a little bit of inspiration in these last few minutes we have together as to projects that you've been involved with, wherever they may be, that have involved nature restoration of the kind that I love to talk about on this podcast, that have been funded through biodiversity credits?
Okay, let me give you two completely different types of examples here. The first one are carbon projects where we quantified the biodiversity gain. Because if companies think, yes, we're going to have to start thinking about units of biodiversity gain, then why not invest in a carbon project that produces a really big uplift as well? And this one is in Costa Rica. It's restoring 30,000 hectares of really badly overgrazed cattle pasture. And the idea is that you offer the farmers contracts we fund them to move to rotational grazing, which allows you to hold actually more cattle per hectare, but it also allows them to the soil to recover because you're leaving it for long periods of time. And the other 15%, you reforest their riparian areas and create wildlife corridors across the landscape. Now that ends up with the farmer making more money. There's more food comes from that process. It stores carbon, it quantifies biodiversity, and that produces a very high quality reforestation carbon credit, which can sell at a premium in the marketplace. So that's one example. The other end of the scale would be somewhere like Transylvania, which is a beautiful site in terms of meadows. And if you haven't been to Transylvania, I'd really urge people to go and have a look at it. Places like Sigishwara and so forth. Around that area, you have a countryside that must have looked like Britain did in the 1700s. So you've got a lot of species there that we sadly no longer have, like redback shrikes and wrynecks, and so they're all gone from here, but they're very common over there. And there you have a system where the European Union has been protecting those high-value nature sites by paying subsidies to the farmers. And this last year, they changed them and they moved them to what's called a corncrake payment. And that's to protect a rare bird over there, which we're all in favour of. And what happens is you get payments of about €280 per hectare for pasture or hay meadow if there is a corncrake breeding somewhere in the same valley that you're working in. Now, the problem with that is the conditions for the hay meadow are that you can't cut it, and you can only cut 80% by the 1st of August, and the other 20% you cut in September. You can't use machinery, it has to be done by hand. So the nutritional value of the hay is virtually zero at that time, and the costs are high. So nobody's going to do that. So what's happening is they say, well, I'll get me 280 payments by using it as pasture, or I'll plough it up and get an arable crop of it. And so what we're doing is providing a private sector version to top up those payments to hay meadows, where we can provide that €280 for sites that don't have corncrakes. I mean, if you obviously got a corncrake in your field breeding, you're going to have to follow those EU rules. But if you don't have one, and the vast majority don't, then they can cut their hay from the middle of June onwards, which allows the hay seed to set and the meadow to be preserved. And it maintains that habitat for a relatively small cost. So we've got a project there. We're protecting about 800 hectares, and it costs about 800,000 for the original investment, but the investor gets their money back plus a 6 to 7% IRR. And that's a way in which you can use the private sector philanthropy type project to be able to really help and make a big difference on the ground to protecting those meadows.
Wow. Well, this is really, really exciting, Tim. I was actually in Transylvania in May 2023 and spent a week hiking with some old school friends. The first time I'd been away on holiday without my family, I think, ever. And it was without all the children. And it was just magical what we found. Like you said, I felt like we were in medieval England. And there is a huge threat to those incredibly flower-rich meadows and those wood pastures. So if biodiversity credits can help bring back to life and protect for the long term that kind of an ecosystem, which may not be suitable for voluntary carbon, then I think we may have stumbled across something incredibly exciting. And Tim, thank you so much. I was a little worried, I have to admit, before having this conversation with you, that the whole thing would be very technical and perhaps even a little impenetrable for people. And I remember my dad used to say that he used to talk about the gift of clarity. And you've definitely got that gift because you've made this so accessible to me and so easy to understand. And I really leave this conversation filled with optimism for the future of biodiversity credit markets and a whole new, potentially massive funding stream for nature recovery in the world. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed that conversation about biodiversity credits and the wider topic of voluntary carbon credits and just how we can get a load more money flowing into rewilding around the world, please do give us a like on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. Please take a moment to ping this to any friends who you think might enjoy it. It just matters hugely. The podcast is growing really fast now, and we want to get these messages out and these stories out to as many people as possible. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Florent Kaiser from Acción Andina, one of the most ambitious forest restoration initiatives in the world. Acción Andina aims to restore the high-altitude forests of the Andes, stretching thousands of kilometers from the south of Venezuela all the way down to Patagonia. And they won an Earthshot Prize, the Prince of Wales's initiative, which provides £1 million and a huge platform to some of the most exciting nature and climate projects in the world.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about the series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.